Welcome to Security Architecture Podcast, where we help cybersecurity professionals to stay ahead of the curve and ensure they are successful in their cybersecurity journey.
Hi, I'm Evgeny.
Hi, I'm Dimitri.
We have Seth here from Merlin. Seth, can you please introduce yourself and the company?
Sure. I'm Seth Spergel from Merlin Ventures. I manage our operations here in the US. Merlin is a 25-year-old company that works primarily in the federal space, helping later stage cybersecurity companies really tackle that market. And about 4 years ago, we saw an opportunity to go spin up a venture arm to go find earlier stage companies that we felt had relevance to the federal market and large enterprises in general. So we stood that up in about 2019. In 2021, we opened up our offices in Israel. And today we have a pretty significant focus on early stage Israeli cyber and helping them understand the US market and eventually grow into the federal market.
Great. And this is a very important episode because it's not a traditional episode about vendors. This episode about what we call MoneyBall. If you guys followed along the last 3 seasons, you know that we invited somebody from the industry, talk about the business and what kind of money moves happening in this. And today we'll talk about browser security, browser isolation, in relation to what Merlin see and what you said say as well.
So Seth, how big is the browser security market in your opinion? And who are the legacy and emerging players?
First off, I think we need to clarify some terminology because I don't think we're always talking about the same thing when we say browser security, right? You've got browser isolation, you've got this new breed of enterprise browsers. In this case here, I think we probably want to talk about enterprise browsers, right? So some of the newer entrants, you've got like Talon and Island and others that are kind of trying to change how we think about how we access our data. You know, when I heard about this space, my initial thought was browser isolation and enterprise browsers were the same thing. And in actuality, they're actually pretty far apart from each other in terms of goals and capabilities. So browser isolation is really an endpoint play designed to protect browsers from web-based threats, which absolutely remains important, right? But when we talk about this new thing called enterprise browsers, we're actually talking about protecting SaaS from the endpoint, right? Really protecting our corporate data from users with unmanaged devices. In terms of like the actual size for that enterprise browser market, it's really pretty large, right? I mean, one of the big arguments for enterprise browsers is they simplify the security architecture that companies need. And they do that because they can replace a number of the existing capabilities that companies are using. So to really get a feel for the TAM, we need to look at, what markets is this really going to enter and disrupt? So, you've got some obvious things like CASB and Secure Web Gateway, or what Gartner's now lumping into SSE. You have some elements of DLP. There's even some elements of like VDI, which this may not necessarily replace, but probably gives us a good feel for just the number of potential users for these types of systems. And at the same time, it potentially also lessens the need for certain other types of solutions like MDM and even enterprise endpoint security on BYO devices. So when we look at all those things together, we're looking at a pretty big TAM. I mean, SSE, where companies like Zscaler play, is a 2 to 3 billion market today and growing pretty quickly. And then, if you look at VDI, that's much bigger even. That's like a $10 billion market. Now, I don't necessarily see like these enterprise browsers fully replacing that because a lot of that is access to legacy systems. But I think you can use that as a proxy for the number of seats that these can potentially be pushed to, the number of users that actually have a need for accessing this type of data from unmanaged devices. I think when you look at it as a whole, it's really quite large potentially. You asked about kind of legacy versus emerging players. Again, I think if we look at the legacy players as browser isolation, then sure, you've got Bromium and folks like that. Again, I don't know if that's the best comparison. I think the real threat that these new enterprise browsers put is to companies like Netscope and Zscaler, right? And the SSE space. You could also say it's a new option for the traditional browser space itself. Instead of deploying Chromium or Firefox or Edge, it's now you use this for accessing your enterprise data. I think right now, if you just look at purely based on fundraising, you've got 2 players that are really dominating the market and the news. So you've got Talon and Island. And, full disclosure, Merlin is an investor in Talon, and we can talk more about that later if you want. But those are kind of the 2 that have just raised, frankly, probably more money than where they are in terms of stage. But there's another number of others that are entering the market with slightly different approaches. Some are bringing full-fledged browsers like Talon and Island. Others are bringing plugins into existing browsers. And so we'll see which approach works best. But right now, I think those are sort of the 2 that get the bulk of press coverage. When you look at where browsers in general are today, right, they've really become a type of operating system, right? You can run, the bulk of the applications we use every day are browser-based. And then when you start to bring in things like WebAssembly, right now you can start to run full-fledged applications directly in your browser. given that power and flexibility, it's pretty easy to see how enterprise browsers do become a platform that a lot of other vendors can plug into and that you can really build upon. I do want to go back to one other thing you said, right? That you don't see browser isolation and enterprise browsers being deployed in the same place. And I think that's a very important point, right? Again, it goes back to, am I protecting the data in my web applications, or am I protecting my endpoint from whatever threats are out there on the web, on untrusted websites, right? So in one case, it's I don't trust the endpoint I'm running on, but I do trust my SaaS applications. And that's where I'm going to deploy enterprise browsers. And the other case, it's I trust my endpoint. It's my managed endpoint. I need to keep it safe, but I don't trust whatever website these people are going to.
And it's probably not just BYOD. It can also be deployed with the traditional enterprise security. And you also mentioned SASE and SSE. So this is quite a lot of different topics.
Yeah.
And SASE and SSE, by definition, it's a number of technologies under one.
Yep.
So basically, if you think about this, are we talking platform play or kind of feature play? Right now, browsers, a bit of a feature play, and they're trying to grow to platform play. What do you think? Where is the market right now? Are we more one feature play or one platform play?
Yeah, it's early, right? I mean, these vendors and the sort of places where you're going to run your traditional endpoint tools like CrowdStrike and others are where you're going to also want to run things like browser isolation. And when you're doing BYOD, that's where you're going to look for enterprise browser type solutions as an easy way to give employees or partners access to trusted resources.
So, Seth, you already mentioned a little bit on this topic. What are the recent significant M&As in the space or some large investment? Can you give us some numbers?
Sure. So first off, I mean, I think we're early enough that we haven't really seen a lot of M&A in this space, at least not that I've been tracking. And like like I mentioned earlier, we did invest in Talon's most recent round. I mean, despite the fact that we invested, I think even I would have trouble arguing that the rounds we're seeing today are justified by where these companies are in terms of revenue and growth, right? It's really more about the belief in the market. So, what I do think is interesting is that belief seemed pretty strong, because when you look at the timing in the market, right? Like right now, we're seeing a big contraction in terms of higher end valuations in the last half of this year. And yet Talon just raised $100 million Series A, and that was announced in the last couple of months. I realize sometimes vendors play games with when they raise and when they announce, but being part of this, I can say like they raised it in the last couple of months. So there's clearly enough belief in these types of companies that people are pouring money into them as investments. So now the question is, what happens to all the other players, right? I mean, you've seen this in other spaces as well, like CSPM, right? Where you've got Wiz and Orca, and they've taken all the air out of the room. And then there's a bunch of other players that sort of struggled to raise. And so I think you've got a lot of other players who are kind of in this space that are coming out now. Again, some are taking the approach of, let me give you a plugin for your browser. Others are saying, I'm going to do it just a different browser, right? And have some different features than the other players. I think that'll play into the M&A story in the future, right? Because right now, Island and Talon are so expensive that they really kind of have to be on a path to IPO at some point to justify the valuations they have. Whereas if you are a company that wants to just pick up a feature and you're less concerned about, name recognition and customer set, you go pick up one of the lesser known brands for a much better price. So I don't know definitively what happens in M&A, but that would be my guess is, some of the lesser known names get snapped up by bigger companies that need to add this as a capability to compete, while the two big guys really remain independent and sort of race to capture the market.
If I bring the conversation back to platform play, when we spoke about browser isolation and enterprise browser, we had ForcePoint, we had SkyHigh, we had Menlo as well, some of the traditional one. And all these players play in SSE and SASE space as well right now. Zscaler has an offering. I think Netscope has one as well. I'm not sure about Palo right now. So all of them have some kind of offering in the browser isolation, but they don't have browser security just because it's literally been less than a year. And I'm kind of wondering, do you think in 2 years, there's not going to be browser security? Enterprise browsers all going to be going under SASE and SSE space?
Yeah, I don't know. That's really up to Gartner how they define, if they expand the definition of SSE. But yes, I do think all those players are going to be pushing into it. I mean, I've talked to some of them and they've explicitly said we are tracking this market closely, right? Because they see it as very disruptive to their existing business. So either they're going to build it themselves, or my guess is, like we just talked about, more than likely find one of these smaller players that hasn't raised as much money and is a little bit more of a deal, right? And pull that into their platform.
So, Seth, given the crowded security market right now, we have identified at least a dozen browser security companies. How these vendors can cause a disruption and cut through the noise and make the differentiation to acquire customers?
Yeah. So I think if you look at others, that have disrupted various markets, right? And how did Apple disrupt and reshape the smartphone market? And it was really by rethinking approaches and simplifying. It wasn't building a better flip phone. And so we didn't need a physical keyboard on phones in order to type. We showed that there was a new way to do it. What they achieved was, creating a single device that replaced a bunch of other things that made people's lives easier. And I don't think the security market's all that different. If you look at what the players in this enterprise browser space are doing, it's rethinking how we address the problem. If we start with a clean slate and throw away the preconceived notions of what security architecture needs to look like, right? Do we need a full SSE stack? Do we need to stand up a secure web gateway that has its own network infrastructure behind it? Do we need to have a separate CASB that everybody's got to jump through in order to get to where they're going? Or can we just push that all down to the place where everybody's already working and control it in a way that keeps us safe, right? And so when I talk to CISOs that are buying these products, because this was a lot of the conversations we had when this market first came out was talking to CISOs and saying, I don't get it. Why are you guys so excited about this? A lot of the answers we got back were, this is so much easier. This is so much simpler, right? Like, I don't have to have the headache of dealing with all these different moving parts and making them work together. I can drop one thing and it just works and gives me everything I need. I think that's how you disrupt the market.
So basically, the future is Chromebooks and browser security solutions.
I mean, it's really going that way, right? And, I mentioned WAS and WebAssembly before, right? Like, at that point, what else do you need, right? When you can run full applications inside of a browser, right? And basically run any programming language inside of that, at that point, it is the operating system. So why bother with other things?
Yeah, it definitely simplifies the defensive mechanisms there. What's interesting is that, like the browser isolations kind of takes the risk away from your organization, right? To someone else's, cloud, to someone else's data center, while the enterprise browser, they actually kind of trying to block the risk and not let it to run in the beginning with, right? To kind of attack you. What do you think about that?
I mean, I would maybe tweak that a little bit. It's not blocking the risk and not letting them attack you, right? It's not letting you attack the company, right? Like, it's putting a bubble, and this is, I'll quote Ofer, right, the CEO of Talon, right? Because this is how he always explains, right? It's putting a bubble around all of your corporate data and making it so that bubble extends to my desktop or my laptop or whatever, right? My phone. So I can work with my corporate data. I can do what I need to do, but it can't get outside of that bubble, right? I can't take it with me. I can't print it. I can't screenshot it. I can't, access it with some tool other than the browser, right? Everything exists only in that browser and cannot get outside of that. So it's not really designed to protect you from going to a bad website. I mean, sure, you can put URL blocking and things like that into it. It's really designed to keep you or a malicious application running on your endpoint from doing something bad with corporate data.
I'm wondering if I'm a VC that's watching this right now, like, I never know this space even exists. What will they need to kind of think about it if they want to invest in such solutions or potentially say this is a winner?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think you've got to first off think, what do you want out of that investment, right? Are you looking for that company that's going to grow and eventually, hopefully, achieve an IPO type status? Or are you looking for somebody who's building a feature that's going to be part of a bigger platform and get acquired? And I think there's very different valuations around those two types of companies today. Again, I think you've got these two market leaders that have just stepped out in front of everyone else that frankly are expensive, but are capturing a lot of the air in the room. And you've got a bunch of others. Some of them have innovative solutions, right? Again, I think there's a lot of merit to, hey, we didn't replace the whole browser, right? We dropped a plugin into your existing browser and secured it, and I'm sure there are others out there that are coming up with even more novel ways of doing things. The question is, are they going to be able to sort of break out and get past where these two companies with big war chests are, or do they even potentially get acquired by one of those two companies? So, in terms of what to look for, I think you can look for some novel capabilities that's going to make it stand out in the market. And you obviously want to look for a solution that is robust enough that it actually solves the problem these customers are trying to deal with in terms of simplicity and security. And then you've got to kind of do the numbers and figure out like what is the most likely exit scenario here as a VC.
Would you say that VCs need to be more technical to understand the difference in the solutions because all the solutions become much more technical right now than in the past?
So, my background is technical, right? I was a VP of engineering before I went to work in VC. And so I would like to say yes, right? But at the end of the day, I think a lot of this is going to depend on execution, right? And it's going to depend on your ability to understand what the market's looking for and your ability to convince customers that you want to use it. So, VCs will often say they're betting on the team, right? More so than the technology product itself. I do think it's important to have a technical enough background to vet the technology and understand that you're investing in a real company and to understand what problem it solves from a technical perspective and does it actually achieve that. But at the end of the day, as much as I would love to say bet on the best technology, right? You need to bet on the best company overall. And the technology is a piece of that, but not the entirety of it.
I have a question, probably discussing this a lot with various CISOs and stakeholders in this space. If company wants to adopt this type of security, what should be their priority? Let's first kind of roll out EDR traditional solutions, or let's first roll out this type of solutions, right? Creating these bubbles, which, taking the risks away and helping the end user to protect himself or protect the organization against the end user.
Today, you start with EDR and eventually and deploy this once you've got your house in order. I think in the longer term, right, over the next few years, as we get a lot more comfortable with the fact that everything lives in the browser and like the endpoint almost doesn't matter anymore, it may shift and we start to deploy this as to what you said earlier, right? Like the Chromebook plus the enterprise browser becomes my only way of working with my corporate data.
What about future M&As? Any crystal ball? Any ideas?
So I think we touched on it a little bit on the earlier question, right? I think it's going to be a number of the smaller players that are going to get acquired because I think Island and Talon have both raised so much money that it's going to be difficult for somebody to acquire them. And my hunch is that the people acquiring them are probably going to be these platform plays that are looking to fill out their solution. So they're not necessarily looking for huge name recognition or customer acquisition. They're looking for a technical feature. So then you kind of say, okay, I want to find that company that has a really good technical solution and maybe doesn't have the best business behind it, right? Because that's easy for me to pull in at a lower cost. What I'm also curious about is what happens not just with the Netscopes and Zscalers of the world, but also companies like Microsoft and Google for that matter. They clearly have an existing browser footprint they can leverage. And so do they push into this space? And what does that do to the market, right? I think that's the biggest kind of question out there is Talon and Island are leading this right now. Can they stay ahead of that? And I think they're both investing very heavily in R&D right now in order to do that, as well as market recognition and trying to get first mover advantage. But in the long run, just like we saw with, Netscope and IE, right? Microsoft has a very big platform and it's going to be a fight, right? And so if those two players push into this, which I imagine they will at some point, then it's sort of anybody's guess where this market goes.
Yeah, I was actually about to ask you about Google, but you answered it itself. Great, Seth. It was a great episode, a lot of good information, different than our traditional, only technical episode. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. A lot of fun.
Thanks.
Please remember to subscribe to our podcast and join us for our next episode.